Hi, and welcome to the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm Jim Weber, your host and guide through actual accounts of intriguing and fascinating true crime stories as told by the law enforcement professional that experienced the event. The Right to Remain Silent podcast makes no exaggeration of fact, doesn't glamorize details, or sensationalize reality. The format here is basic. Real stories from real cops. Lastly, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Doing this will help me continue to provide you, the listener, with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Now, let's listen in on today's episode. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Right to Remain Silent podcast. Today's guest is retired FBI Special Agent Shawn Johnson, and we will be discussing a series of bank robberies that he investigated in Seattle, Washington. Today's episode is called Unraveling the Chase, a conversation with retired FBI Special Agent Shawn Johnson about his multi-year pursuit of the Hollywood Bandit Bank Robbers. Shawn's going to discuss and share details concerning his bank robbery investigation of Scott Scurlock, Steve Myers, Mark Biggins, and others, known as the Hollywood Bandits. This occurred between 1992 and 1996 in Seattle, Washington. Shawn's investigation is currently featured on Netflix and is called How to Rob a Bank. And the program was described by Netflix as a 1 hour and 26-minute documentary. And here's the description. Scurlock masterminded an unprecedented spree of bank robberies right out of the movies, who was a daring bandit known as Hollywood. This is a true crime documentary. And actually, in preparing for our conversation today, I had to get onto Rotten Tomatoes, the website, and I looked into the How to Rob a Bank episode, and it got nothing but great reviews and positive feedback, 100% on one of the, they call it the tomato meter. So, that's a good sign. Let me start with reading Shawn's bio. Shawn Johnson graduated from Winona State University in Winona, Minnesota with a degree in criminal justice. He then attended William Mitchell College of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota, receiving his Juris Doctorate degree. He was accepted immediately into the FBI and trained at the FBI Academy prior to his first assignment to the Seattle, Washington division. Initially, he was part of the task force investigating the Green River serial murder case. That in itself could be a whole nother conversation. After that, he was assigned to the Violent Crime Squad, where he investigated and responded to bank robberies, fugitives, interstate theft, extortions, and kidnapping. His law background proved valuable as the Assistant Chief Division Counsel. Soon, he was assigned to the National Security Squad, where he worked both counterterrorism and counterintelligence operations. Shawn was afforded the opportunity to work jointly with the United States Army and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in overseas investigations. Following that, he was reassigned to the Violent Crime Squad, during which time his responsibilities included the Hollywood investigation. Shawn was instrumental in the establishment of the Puget Sound Violent Crime Task Force, where he became the bank robbery coordinator and wrote the bank robbery response plan for the division. He then volunteered for a transfer to the Milwaukee, Wisconsin division and was assigned to the Madison Resident Agency. Here he applied his knowledge to the area of drug conspiracies, utilizing sophisticated surveillance techniques, resulting in substantial takedowns of drug organizations in the Chicago, Illinois, and Madison, Wisconsin venues. Following 9/11, Shawn managed the newly established Madison Joint Terrorism Task Force, consisting of federal and local law enforcement agencies responsible for investigating international terrorism activities. An opportunity led him to return to the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, where he instructed new agent trainees in the areas of criminal investigations, counterterrorism investigations, and human intelligence, or HUMIN. His last assignment with the FBI was the Directorate of Intelligence Training, onboard agents in human policy and procedures. Upon his retirement from the FBI, Shawn established his consulting company, Wolf and Owl LLC, where he continues to train FBI personnel for its mission to protect the United States. I have to say, that is an impressive bio, Shawn. It seems that you've worked a variety of investigative components within the FBI, and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Nice talking with you today. Yeah, it was a long and very interesting career, 29 years in the Bureau, which is amazing since I'm retired now for 8 years, which is, the time flies by pretty quickly, but a pleasure to talk with you today about the Hollywood investigation.
Great, thanks. Before we get into discussing the investigation, could you tell the listeners what got you into law enforcement? Why did Shawn get into law enforcement, and why specifically the FBI?
Well, Jim, my undergrad was in criminal justice, of course, as you mentioned in the bio. Throughout my undergrad, I was planning on being a police officer or a deputy sheriff somewhere in the state of Minnesota. When I finished up undergrad, I actually did an internship at the St. Paul Police Department for that summer, and took my interest in that career. My sister at the time happened to be an attorney who had gone to William Mitchell College of Law, and she basically encouraged me to take the LSAT and apply for law school, which wasn't my intent in the first place, but did well, got into law school, and finished up my last year looking for a career. And it was between the FBI, and I was also looking to the Army JAG Corps. And the FBI came through first, and was sent to Quantico, Virginia for training.
There you go. That's pretty interesting. That's an interesting journey there. Did your law school education benefit your career with the Bureau?
Oh, I believe so. I was interested in criminal law, and used the training I had from law school, as far as investigations, and also working directly with the United States Attorney's Office and Assistant U.S. Attorneys in a number of cases. So at least I had that background, understand what their mission was, what they needed to successfully prosecute an investigation. So it helped out tremendously.
Sure. Oh, I would imagine. I would imagine the assistant U.S. attorneys loved working with you, because not only are you the agent, but you're, like you just said, you're looking at it from the perspective of an attorney and in the prosecution avenue. So I'm pretty confident they enjoyed working with you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't wait to get into discussing this investigation, this conversation. So let's roll up the sleeves and get to work on this and discuss your multi-year robbery spree investigation of Scott Scurlock, known as Hollywood, and his associates.
Mm-hmm.
Please, you're the expert here. You lived this, you breathed this for years. So if I misstate something, please let me know. Please clarify that, because I'm operating based off watching the Netflix program, How to Rob a Bank, in conversations that you and I have had. So again, you're the expert. If I misstate something, you won't hurt my feelings. Please clarify it. All right.
Well, this investigation started back in June 1992 when Scott robbed his first bank, which was a Seafirst Bank in Madison Park. Interesting part about that was his first robbery, so it wasn't very successful. They had patterned themselves after various movies that were out at the time, and he and his partner Mark had worn president's masks into that robbery. And their plan was to steal a vehicle from a customer to get away, which didn't turn out too well. And they ended up running across a golf course. And again, that was their first experience in this realm. And actually also that when Scott was in the bank with Mark, he actually used the name Mark at one point in time during the robbery when he said, you got to get out of here, Mark, or something to that effect.
Sure.
That was their first robbery. It didn't go too well for them. They robbed the second bank about 2 months later. Didn't do so well there either. Another month later, they robbed the U.S. Bank. Again, not that successful. And then about a week after that third robbery, they robbed another bank. Again, they weren't getting a lot of money up until that point. Out of those four robberies, they had about $43,000. So give or take, about average of $10,000 a robbery, which is more than average. The average bank robber probably gets about $4,000 and isn't going into a vault or a takeover situation that they evolved into. But they were doing okay, but not great. And I think at that point in time, they decided that it wasn't worth that little bit of money for the risk that they were exposing themselves to. So the fifth robbery was actually the first robbery they entered the vault for the first time. And so that was Great Western Bank in October of '82. So by the fifth robbery, they had, perfected the craft a little bit, and were able to come up with their plan how to get away from the bank and
Sure.
But that was the fifth robbery. After that, another month later, they had another Seafirst Bank. A week after that, another Seafirst Bank. Actually, two of the Seafirst banks that they hit three times each. They would go back to that same bank.
The same facility, right?
Same bank, yeah. And actually, I've talked to tellers that experienced at least one, maybe two, maybe three robberies that they saw Scurlock come into the banks and hit their banks. So
wow,
somewhat old home week sometimes when he was coming back.
Yeah, I'm not a bank robbery agent, but that seems pretty bold to me to do that. Is it?
It's very bold. I mean, typical bank robber would probably rob maybe four banks, and that's would be arrested within the fourth robbery. So he already passed the normal amount of robberies without getting caught. And I think they were, again, just trying to perfect their craft. And, out of the 19 robberies they did, Scott did some on his own. Others had Steve help. Others had Mark help, or sometimes all three of them. So it kind of was a mixture of the three people involved in these robberies. But so my first robbery I investigated when I transferred back to the Mountain Crime Squad was U.S. Bank. Was January 21st of 1994. And then again, that was my first robbery I responded to. Subsequent to that, I was assigned the case. That was the case agent for the FBI.
It was given directly to you,
Correct,
as the lead, or as like we call it, the case agent.
case agent. Yeah, I was solely responsible.
You're the primary investigator. Okay.
Correct. So again, that was January '94. You had another Seafirst Bank a month later after that. And then, interestingly enough, at the time we weren't quite sure about this, but he had two banks in Portland, Oregon. So he did one. First one he did was June of '94. It didn't go too well for him there either, because he was with Steve at the time, I believe, and he was unable to have the vault teller open the vault, and so he got no money from that bank robbery. So that was the first time he didn't hit any proceeds.
Sure.
So that was a bit frustrating.
I have to say, I'm glad to hear that that they didn't get anything from one. That's good.
Yeah. So then a month later, he came back up to Seattle and hit a First Interstate Bank in Queen Anne branch area, and he got about $117,000 from that one. So that was a pretty good haul.
So they're honing their craft, they're honing their skills with each incident, and they're increasing the amounts that they're getting. Is what it sounds like. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. So after that First Interstate robbery, about 5 months later, he hit a U.S. bank, again, back down in Portland, Oregon. The vault teller was not there at the time. And this is the first and only time he used a weapon, because he had a stun gun with him and probably was frustrated, angry, whatever it was, and used a stun gun and teller that robbery.
So Scott did that.
Correct.
So there is a level of they're displaying firearms in these robberies, and that's a degree of violence right there. Assaulting somebody with a stun gun. So it seems like they're honing their skills. They're perfecting their craft, and it seems in as you continue to discuss it, you tell us it seems like perhaps the violence or the threat or the veil of perceived violence, perhaps it increases as it goes?
Well, I would have to say, after talking with Steve and Mark during the Proppers, his investigation years later, Steve said that basically Scott would not go into the bank wild and crazy, because wild and crazy doesn't do the job. Cool, calm, and collected does the job. People respect when the orders he's giving. It's not, things aren't going chaos in the bank, and that's the way Scott wanted it. Was, more of that kind of level. So
Okay.
as far as escalating the violence, I didn't feel as though that was a plan on theirs. It was basically
Okay.
to get in and out of that bank as quickly and efficiently as possible without causing any problems.
Okay. All right.
So the reason he used that stun gun in Portland that day might have just been the fact that the second time down there he wasn't getting the money he was expecting.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah. So that was the 13th robbery that they did. Now we're, of course, in December '94. He hits back in Seattle, First Interstate Bank, in January of '95. And that one didn't go so well either because his career was pretty successful considering other bank robbers, but he had his days where it wasn't a good day for him because at that robbery he had a die pack, which is included in the teller drawers. So once you walk out the bank with that die pack, electronically it explodes on you seconds later, and red dye stain comes out of it. You can almost see as gas.
Is that as dramatic as you see on movies and TV shows where it just boom, it explodes and sprays?
Right. There's a time delay on the device, so 10 seconds, 30 seconds later, it'll blow up on you. So again, with the red dye and the CS gas.
Hey,
So,
let me go back real quick.
Sure.
I hate to interrupt. But for the purpose of clarification for the listeners, you mentioned the term proffer. You and I know what that is, but essentially, could you just give a general explanation of what a proffer is for the
So
listeners?
the proffer is a follow-up interview, and I spent about a week with both Steve and Mark doing this process. It's their opportunity to come clean with everything, all the robberies participated in. Anything they say is not used against them in case, we were charged at that last bank robbery, amongst other charges. But it's their opportunity to come clean with it. And if we find other robberies or other things they've been involved in that they did not mention in the proffer, they would be susceptible to being prosecuted for those. Anything they give us during the proffer as part of the plea agreement.
Okay. So it's essentially a come to Jesus meeting where they come in and they sit down and they explain the facts and they explain their involvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again,
Okay.
it's probably a week with each of them, going way back to well before the robberies. When they met Scott, the whole process up until the last robbery, in November '96. So.
Yeah, and for the listeners, that's quite a while. I mean, a typical proffer, at least in my experience, is you might sit down with an individual for a couple hours and you've interviewed them and you go on your way.
Right.
For that length of time, that seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, fairly extensive.
Right. And I wanted them, I wanted to know the whole story, how this all started, where they went, how it progressed throughout the 19 robberies. Just a lot of information that wasn't necessarily germane to the prosecution itself, but to give them not to explain what they did, why they did it in this that form of fashion. So again, that was a very lengthy process.
Okay. All right. And I apologize for interrupting. So let's move back around to that incident with the die pack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So he walked out of the bank. He approached a getaway vehicle, which was parked in the parking lot. And at that point in time, as he's entering the car, the die pack explodes. He drops $11,000 in the bank. So,
wow.
Mm-hmm. And again, another time he was not successful. But for me, at that point in time, we basically had our first clue. Because up until that 14th robbery that day, we had nothing to go on. He was wearing this elaborate disguise. Nobody could identify him. He had left nothing behind. This was the first time that when he made that mistake of getting the die pack, that we were able to actually get some information on his case. Meaning the car that we recovered that day, which was a station wagon. And we traced the registered owner back to somebody who lived in Tacoma, Washington. Now, later on, of course, we found out that Scott lived in Olympia, nearby Tacoma. Person that sold that station wagon to somebody, whether it was Scott, Mark, or Steve, or somebody else that they had paid to go buy a car for them, they paid $800 in cash for that station. And again, this is 2 months in advance of the robbery in January. And through that, we were able to get a composite sketch. And the first of the two we got, who we thought potentially was involved in this case. In this case, the purchaser of the vehicle back in November of '94.
Okay.
So that was our first clue that we had up until that point.
Sure. Yeah. Like the whole time. I mean, this, in our conversation before we started here, it seems these guys are, for lack of a better term, slick. They're pretty sharp. They're squared away. They operate in a professional manner. And all this time, as time passes and the number of robberies increase, I can only imagine the frustration that you and your team have, because you don't really have any good leads up until this point that you're discussing here.
Right. I mean, the average bank robber, again, who got about $4,000, the typical disguise was a hat and sunglasses. That was it.
Right.
There's no pre-planning involved. And we knew in this case, pre-planning, they were at least planning a couple months in advance buying a car for cash.
So, yeah. Wow. And I'll mention this. While this is going on in the Seattle area, while Scott Scurlock and his team are conducting these bank robberies, that doesn't mean all other crime has stopped in Seattle. There's other bank robberies going on. And from my understanding, in that time frame, in that area, there was the tech boom. That
Microsoft and Boeing were going big time.
Yeah. So and along with that comes money, and along with that, financial institutions to manage and maintain that money. So it sounds like that Seattle area was like shooting fish in a barrel, bank robbery wise.
Yeah, I think our top year we had 320 in Seattle division, 220 bank robberies. And as a bank robbery coordinator, I was responsible for oversighting all those banks, plus we assigned cases, including Hollywood. So it was a busy time. And I think another factor in that was during that boom during the 90s in Seattle was that the banks were expanding operations too, expanding hours, expanding days they're open, because they're expanding grocery stores and other locations. So banking was booming too, which provided more opportunity for people to rob.
Right, a larger array of potential targets, it sounds like.
Right.
Okay.
So it was crazy time. In any given year, I think Seattle division was in the top 5 in the country for bank robberies.
Wow.
Los Angeles is what we call the bank robbery capital of the world, so they always had well over 1,000 robberies a year in the LA area. But up and down I-5 between Seattle, Portland, Sacramento, San Francisco, down to LA and San Diego, we had typically probably 45% at least of bank robberies in the country happen on the West Coast.
That's amazing.
Well, West business, right?
Right. I want to circle back real quick. You had mentioned when you were talking and describing things earlier there, you had mentioned movies. And two movies of particular interest, as I was preparing to talk to you today, that came to my mind that were mentioned in the Netflix show. At least one of them was the show or the movie Point Break.
Point Break.
Which was around, I think it came out in the time frame that these bank robberies were occurring. And that, for those that are, and for those that aren't familiar with that, that's about a band of rogue, free-spirited surfers that travel, around and rob banks while being pursued by the FBI. Essentially what's going on with you in your case.
Yeah, and after everything being down this investigation, there was a lot of similarities between Scott Scurlock and the main character in Point Break, right? Brody, I think it was his name. Yeah. Wine Women's Song, travel around the world, which Scott did, multiple trips throughout the years. I think he maybe envisioned himself as a bit of a Point Break Brody guy, and he was actually, based on what I found out about him after the fact.
It kind of struck me as that, just watching, I've seen that movie a couple times, and then watching the Netflix show, it struck me exactly like that. And then another movie that came out, I think, in that same time frame was the movie Heat, where there was a crew of bank robbers doing the same thing. And I want to say that's one of the most, what would you say, prolific bank robbery shootout scenes that I've ever seen in a movie. And I think reference was made in the Netflix show that Scott and maybe Biggins, or at least Scott, had seen that movie, and they're kind of like, "Whoa, this is real. A shootout could happen and something like that." And you almost kind of look at that as foreshadowing, maybe in a way, to how this investigation concluded.
Yeah, my understanding from Mark through the Netflix show was he mentioned, at least he and Scott watching that movie, and he's saying, "What are we getting into here? What's the potential here? What could happen?" Right? I'm sure I thought about that in advance, but that movie came out shortly before the last robbery. So I remember Mark going, "This is crazy. This is crazy. This happened to us."
It seems almost surreal. Like if you put yourself in their shoes, that would almost be surreal at that point. But I interrupted you. I just wanted to circle back for that. So if you'll just kind of continue on and discuss how this continued to unfold.
So after that robbery not successful because of the die pack, he came back a week later. Again, sometimes he'd gone for a week, sometimes months, and sometimes a year, which we'll get to in a minute here. But his pattern was somewhat erratic. But later on, we'll talk about how I kind of put this together and figure out what's a likely time for him to come back, likely targets, because we had to be proactive with this. Because at this point, up until the point that I got involved in and started in kind of trying to determine some patterns here, it was basically a reactive approach to it. Reacting to bank robberies after bank robbery, which really doesn't get you anywhere. You have to be proactive in this investigation, especially with somebody of this sophistication. So you just can't wait for him to come back, because he will come back. But what are you going to do about it when he does? Right?
Yeah.
That's part of the strategy that I came up with later on. But
we'll get into that.
Yeah.
We'll get into that a little bit later. That is a fascinating aspect in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. So after that robbery, about a week later, he came back again to see First Bank. Now, this is Madison Park branch. This is the third time he hit that same branch. This is now January of 95.
Wow.
That is his first robbery. He got about $250,000 from that robbery. $252,000 to be specific.
That one robbery. Wow. Okay. It's stepping up from the beginning at $4,000 or $5,000 a pop to very substantial now.
Right. And that again was probably their biggest heist so far. I'm pretty sure it was $252,000. So at that point, now this is January '95. Following that, I stood up the Puget Sound Violent Crimes Task Force, which came to fruition in March of '95. We can talk about that a bit too.
Sure. Yeah, please do.
So the task force was formed in March of '95 to combat violent crime in general, but specifically in this case, bank robberies. We had at the time 13 members on that task force, including FBI, ATF, DEA, Seattle Police Department, King County Sheriff's Office, and Mercer Island Police Department were our members.
Okay.
At that time, when the task force was formed, we already had 15 Hollywood bank robberies occurred.
Wow. Super substantial.
Much later.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like, and for the listeners, a task force is essentially various law enforcement agencies and departments working in conjunction with one another to address, like you said, violence and bank robbery. So pulling from the resources of the local police, pulling from the resources of DEA, pulling from the resources of FBI, and pooling that all together is a fantastic approach to address these types of situations. So,
right.
So you stood that up during the time frame of all this going on.
Right. And that was done through coordination, of course, in various departments and agencies. Also, at the time, my special agent in charge, SAC, was Brie Passanelli, who was a fantastic person. She was instrumental in also getting this formed. So I'll give her credit for that, because she was a wonderful, wonderful boss, and she was very instrumental in this case too. Sadly, she passed away a few years ago, but I just want to mention her name, Brie Passanelli.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, for folks that just aren't familiar, you don't just come up with an idea and snap your fingers and it happens and it, immediately occurs. There's a lot of behind the scenes work, and you must have the support of your management. So it sounds like you were fortunate to have an SAC like that.
Right. No. So anyway, we got the task force rolling in. After that, I started diving more deeper into these 15 robberies we had because, again, reactive approach to it, which meant, this how long is it going to continue, right? So I started basically diving through the files, the FBI files. So with that, based upon locations in the city, time of day, day of week, the amount taken, which was approximately $21,000 a month. $21,000 a month.
And that's kind of what it averaged. That's what you kind of calculated into.
Okay. And that's tax free.
Right. They weren't paying taxes on that. Right.
No, I don't think so. The funny thing about that too is, that's quite a bit of money. And actually, Scott kept the majority of that money. When Steve and/or Mark helped him, he would give him a cut of that, but not much. Maybe
nothing substantial.
I'm thinking maybe 10-20% at most. Right. So he was keeping most of himself.
Okay.
So,
what was he? Are you aware of what was he spending that on? Earlier you mentioned he did some international travel and that type of thing. Are you do you even know what
actually,
he was?
Some of his trips, there were 3 major trips he took during the course of these robberies. The first one was in April '93. He went to Bhutan, Nepal, and Canada in April '93. In February '94, he went to Ecuador for a period of time. And his last trip for the last robbery was the Seychelles Islands, off the coast of Africa.
Wow. That's interesting. It's not like your typical tourist destinations like Cancun or something like that. Those are fairly interesting locations, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. And so that last trip, he was there at Seychelles Islands from February to April. And of course, he had plenty of money to make these trips.
Sure. Sure.
But that's right. In tying back into the whole Point Break movie, right? I think just that lifestyle he led, right?
Right.
He wasn't just spending money on drugs like most bank robbers. He was spending money on his lifestyle to support his lifestyle. So again, it's just interesting the character that this is what he spends his money on.
Yep. Hey, let me ask this. And I can't think off the top of my head. I can't think of the name of the organization, but it was referenced in the Netflix show that Scott would donate money to some sort of like Save the Trees type of environmentalist
I think it was
program.
If I remember correctly, for the first years I mentioned.
That sounds right. That's right. Is there any evidence that he did do that, or do you think that was just talk? Sometimes it's hard to tell.
I have no information that he ever did that. That might have just been a persona that he had, or I think the other thing that came out at the end of the case was he envisioned himself as some type of Robin Hood, the rich give to the poor. Well, he didn't do that either. He took from the banks and spent the money.
Sure. And that's interesting you say that because as I was preparing for our conversation today, I spoke to a number of folks that had watched the Netflix show, and they mentioned to me, they're like, hey, they kind of portray this guy as just what you said, a Robin Hood type figure, where he's robbing and he's, giving out to needy people that could really utilize this. And I don't want to say glorified, but kind of shined a positive light on him. So it's interesting to hear that.
Yeah. But again, I have no reason to believe he gave money to causes, or the only cause he gave to was himself.
Right. And you boil it down and I'm going to give my opinion here at the conclusion. He's a self-centered guy. Like, just he's robbing all these banks, taking all this money, doesn't care the harm or emotional stress he inflicts on people. And as you described, he's giving minuscule percentages to his accomplices. And it just seems like a self-centered type of individual taking that money and doing those things for himself.
Yeah, and of course, he was taking most of the risk by going to the banks himself, too. So
sure, that's a great point. Yeah. Yep.
maybe have that in mind too.
Maybe that's how he rationalized it there. So that is a great point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'll try to stop interrupting you. I just find what you're saying so fascinating.
So that prediction I made right after the robbery in January of '95, I picked 3 days the following year in January, both January 23rd, January 24th, and January 25th and '96. Again, based on the time between robberies, the amount of money taken, locations in the city, various factors that I figured, well, I think just in my own mind, this is a logical time for them to come back. So
that's a lot of number crunching there. You're like you said, you're pulling those files and you're drilling down and you're crunching the numbers and the facts and calculating these things. What is the time frame of when you sat and you came to that conclusion of, hey, I think it's going to happen here? What is the time frame that passed to that actually occurring?
exactly 1 year.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Okay. Continue on there, please.
So now we're in January of '96, a year later after his robbery in January of '95. January 23rd came up. I had folks go out and do surveillances on logical targets and banks in Seattle, primarily in North Seattle. Nothing happened. January 24th, I did the same thing, although the number of people that were willing to volunteer dwindled from the first day because nothing had happened the first day. So
right.
I don't know about this.
They're sitting there like boring.
I don't know about this, Shawn. You're
right.
picking dates and whatever. So second day, nothing happened. Now it's the third day, January 25th, which was a Thursday. Basically, I went up by myself because I'm gonna follow up. I'm gonna follow through with this prediction, whether it happens or not. I'm still gonna follow through with it.
Yeah.
January 25th, I'm setting up on a Seafirst Bank in North Seattle. The tones come out bankrupt about a few blocks north of me, which was the First Interstate Bank. When I heard the description come out, I said, "Damn, that's Hollywood." The third day, from a year before, he hit that day.
You were spot on your calculation.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But
that is amazing.
And we didn't have the resources after the day because, it was just a prediction. So that robbery, he got about $114,000. But I was 6 blocks away. I was the first one to get to that bank. I was right there even before the Seattle Police Patrol got there, I think.
Wow.
And, to describe my feeling at that point in time was frustration, anger, disappointment. I don't know what to say, but we could have had him that day. We had the resources out there.
I can only imagine you are this close to that guy and him robbing that bank, and you calculated it and you put yourself, like you said, within blocks of that occurring. So I can imagine that emotion that's flowing through you there. Like you said, got to be frustrating.
Right. So when I got to the bank, this is now the second time we uncovered getaway, which was another clue in this case, which was helpful because I got to the location of the car, which was a couple blocks from the bank. My first thought was, I'm going to sit in this car. And this guy Hollywood was just in this a few minutes ago. And I'm going to sit in this car and just, I don't know what, but
soak it in, absorb it.
Soak it in. And so I'm thinking, is this guy, some kind of ghost? Is he just getting away with this and just disappears into thin air, which has been the case so far, right? But anyway, I was able to trace that car back to registered owner, which was in Kent, Washington, which is south of Seattle. Same thing with the first car. Again, he or somebody had bought that car for cash 2 months in advance. This is again another station link. Through that, we got another artist deposit, another artist sketch of the purchaser of that car. They had bought that car for $1,200 in cash. Of course, we never re-registered it. They didn't care if that car was ever seen because they're just driving away from the bank in it. And typically,
they're going from point A to point B.
Right. And Steve or Mark would be some other location during the bank picking him up and driving back into Washington. Nobody in the place.
Sure.
But with that car, I brought the registered owner up to take a look at it, just thinking, whatever. So I asked him, is there anything different about this car than when you sold it 2 months ago? Anything? He said, yeah, those are new tires. New tires.
Wow.
And I didn't know at the time, found out though, that I actually was able to trace those tires back to where they were bought. These were serial numbers on tires.
Okay. Okay.
And found out those tires had purchased in Tacoma, Washington, sometime after that November when they bought the car. So now I had first car being purchased in Tacoma, the second car in Kent, and new tires being put in that car months in advance in Tacoma. So I had a feeling something was going on in the Tacoma Olympia area. That's where the operation being extended around, which eventually was the case. So that was, that was a little bit of information we got from that area.
Sure. And that's fascinating. People don't. I don't think people realize. Hey, there's serial numbers on these tires, and we can track it. And when you're operating in the manner you are, and this is all a high number of bank robberies are occurring, and you're investing all this time and effort, and you're not coming up with clues or evidence that is helpful. That in itself, right there, that tire incident sounds like it was I don't want to say game changer, but super helpful to your investigation.
It was. We narrowed our focus on where these guys are originating from. So, and again, we got the sketch from that robbery. So again, that was January '96.
Okay.
About 4 months later, we hit a 17th, which was Wells Fargo. First time we hit a Wells Fargo bank in this group. Both Steve and Mark were involved in that one. He got about $114,000 from that robbery. After that, again, now it's 17 robberies into this career. 17 robberies, and we still got a little bit closer, but not close enough.
Sure, and that's substantial. And like you said, a typical bank robber, 3-4 robberies and out. 17. Again, I was in law enforcement 30 years, but never worked bank robberies. That to me sounds substantial.
So following that, I at the same time I was signed the Hollywood case. I was also the bank robbery coordinator. I also did bank security training for the banks in the area. So what their response was or their protocol during a robbery. So I go out and teach the various branches what we do, what they should or shouldn't do during a robbery. So I was pretty close. I worked a lot with the bank security officers out there, Wells Fargo, Seafirst, First State Bank, amongst others. So I was able to get the cooperation of both Wells Fargo and Seafirst Bank to put up a $50,000 reward for this case. And in that reward, again, from Wells Fargo and Seafirst, leading to identification, arrest, and conviction of Hollywood for the EP, right?
Sure.
I had on the water poster, I had a picture of one of the surveillance pictures. There was one of the banks. I had the 2 sketches I had obtained. So this reward was out there, and I believe that in talking with Mark or Steve after the takedown, they were aware of that reward. And I think in some form or fashion, for Scott to kind of step the game up, he's wanted officially 50,000 reward.
Sure.
I don't know why, but
yeah.
So I think it became more personal. It was personal to me.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it was so personal for you. According to the program, you're out walking the streets. You're handing out flyers. You're interacting with the public. You're trying so many things, almost somewhat unconventional methods, to address this. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to get out and about because I didn't want to sit behind my desk and wait for the next robbery. I mean, That doesn't accomplish anything, right? So I would get out in the neighborhoods after the robberies and pass out these flyers. Have you seen this person? Anything, any information they have? Didn't really generate much because unless you were in the inner circle that knew Scott, who was doing, otherwise, he had a pretty tight circle of people that knew about this. Basically, he, Mark, and Steve. Two others tangentially, but he kept it very close to home. So I didn't look at surveillance photos. I mean, there's no way somebody could call and, that looks like such and such. Well, it doesn't, because
Right.
So,
Right.
just trying to be proactive about it. So we got
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
So you've got this, you've got a $50,000 reward now. So go on from there. Like, did that generate any significant leads or assistance?
Not really. No, it was out there. It eventually ended up being paid out, which we'll get to after the last robbery. But
Sure.
somebody did receive the money. Thank you.
Huh, okay.
But at the time, no. So now we're into August of '96, after the 17th robbery. In coordination with Seattle Police Department, and most of the robberies, except for 2 or 4 of them, happened in the city of Seattle. So they had invested interest in this also. So working with them, we came up with what we call the Hollywood Operations Order, which came out in August '96. Based on the situation, now we had level of sophistication of these robberies, potential threat to public safety, and over $1 million now from losses. The mission was to basically expedite and coordinate efforts for Seattle's SPD's responsibilities in the response procedures to the events. Knowing in advance it's probably Hollywood.
Sure.
How we're going to execute this mission, right? Which meant surveillance in targeted zones, which identified, likely areas you may hit it. So that came into play again in August of '96.
Okay.
Seattle Police Department, the 2 sergeants, Sergeant McDonough and Sergeant Mullendorf, I'm going to credit to, they came up with this operations order. And kind of focused SPD's efforts on their response plan, but overlying that, the FBI investigation to coordinate with them in future projects.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So in August, that same time, we began the surveillance. But before that, just like with the reward money, talking to banks, there was a technology that came out of there's a company in Texas called ProNet, PRONET, that has electronic tracking devices, which you can place in the money in vaults and toll doors. Once they were taken out of the bank, they began emitting a radio frequency that transmitted back to communication center at SPD, but also in our vehicles for the task force, we had the ability to track those devices throughout the city.
We're going to stop right here to conclude part 1 of this 2-part series with retired FBI Special Agent Shawn Johnson and his discussion of the Scott Scurlock Hollywood Bandit Bank Robberies. Join us next Monday, July 22nd, for the thrilling conclusion in episode 3, part 2 of this series, where Shawn will continue to discuss the jaw-dropping details of this investigation and bring us to the conclusion. The suspense is definitely building here. 17 banks have been robbed and over $1 million in cash has been stolen. Law enforcement really doesn't have any solid leads at this point, so a $50,000 cash reward is now being offered for information about the elusive Hollywood and his partners. Plus, law enforcement continues their relentless pursuit, now deploying cutting-edge tracking technology, installing tracking devices in bank vaults across the Seattle area. Is this going to be enough? Will these measures help identify, track, and apprehend Hollywood and his crew? Can the FBI bring an end to this multi-year bank robbery spree that has gripped the Seattle region? The investigation intensifies as we continue our discussion next week in episode 3, part 2 of this episode. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you or someone you know has an interesting law enforcement story to share, please feel free to contact me. If you're interested in Streetwise 360 law enforcement instruction and media consulting, providing classroom instruction, case study discussions, or media consulting services, please contact me via my website at www.streetwise-360.com. www.streetwise-360.com. Please remember to like, follow, subscribe, and share our content so that I can continue to bring you top quality guests with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Please continue to tune into the Right to Remain Silent podcast for high caliber true crime stories and content. Thanks and stay safe.